Good morning and welcome on behalf of our president, Raleigh Flynn, I'd like to welcome you to this morning's panel discussion on power distribution and its impact on development and politics in Africa. These webinars are brought to you free, but as President Flynn says in her introductions, they're free to you, but not free to us. They are brought to you by the largesse of our members and supporters. And if you are not a member or a supporter of FPRI, I encourage you to go to fpri.org and join us so that we can continue to bring you these events. Today, we have a distinguished panel of three experts on affairs Afrique. Professor Paul Nantulya from the National Defense University, Michael Walsh, who is an senior Africa fellow at Georgetown and Howard University in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and an old friend of mine from the Africa Center for the Study of the U.S. At the Witwatersrand University in South Africa, Mr. Bob Wekesa. And that's really about all the introduction that these gentlemen need. Most of you who are joining us today have heard them before, and you know that they bring a wealth of knowledge to the situation in Africa, especially policy towards Africa. We're going to be talking about a very critical issue today, and one that many people probably don't think much about, and that's power distribution. And by that I mean energy, electrical power in all its forms, development across the continent. And I will start, we will start today with short introductions from our three panelists of 3 to 4 minutes, and start with Professor Nantulya and followed by Bob Wekesa and then Michael Walsh. And with that, I will ask Professor Nantulya, please, if you would take the stage.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, and good morning or good evening to Michael and Bob. It's nice to be with you again after a few days. Let me make a few remarks to start with. The first is that China is a critical player in this space. It contributes more funding on a per capita basis, more funding to power generation in Africa. That is hydropower, oil and gas, solar, wind, geothermal, than any other industrialized country, and even more than the World Bank, which typically finances these sorts of sectors. So one might argue from that perspective that the People's Republic of China has got a special responsibility, because when we talk about power distribution, it is important not just to look at the numbers or the volume of finance, but also to look at how this finance is distributed, how these projects are distributed in the countries concerned. So that is the first issue. The second one is the potential for Chinese engagements, if leveraged well, if they respect oversight, institutions of oversight, if they respect accountability, if they respect public participation, awareness, and input, the potential for these investments to be game-changing. Because when you consider the fact that Africa, according to the African Union, has got an infrastructure deficit of $128 billion a year. That's very, very high. A little wonder that the African Union Agenda 2063 identifies infrastructure as a strategic priority for African countries. But then on the back end of that infrastructure is power. 600 million Africans, 600 million, that's almost a billion, do not have access to electricity, and they don't have access to good fuel for cooking. That's really an unacceptable number. It's unacceptably very high, and it does contribute. Those levels of poverty and deprivation contribute to conflict and grievances. So because China is very much engaged in both sectors, the power distribution side as well as the infrastructure side, 1 out of every 3 infrastructure projects is built by a Chinese state-owned enterprise. 1 out of every 5 is financed by a Chinese policy bank. Again, the People's Republic of China has got a special responsibility because these are sectors that can also generate conflict, depending on how those resources are distributed. The third element, I think, is more from touches on larger international issues, namely that even by the admission of the African Union and African governments, no one developing partner or developing institution, right? I mentioned the World Bank, can address these gaps in Africa on its own. In other words, address the infrastructure gap, and on the other hand, put as many Africans on the electric grid. No one country can achieve this. No one institution can achieve this. So this is one area, like it or not, where China has got to find a way of working with other international actors, working with international institutions, and working with African countries in a multilateral way. This is actually a multilateral priority. And I believe that because now we're in a space of intensifying strategic rivalry and competition, particularly between China and the United States, this really should be one area where that competition can be put aside to ensure that resources are mobilized, to benefit the poorest of the poor on this continent. I think it's a strategic imperative because, again, you're talking about the youngest continent in the world, where upwards of 80% are between the ages of 15 and 30. There is a strategic imperative to ensure a proper stewardship of resources, to ensure that these sectors are addressed, and to ensure that the distribution patterns do not exacerbate conflict and tension. That's what I would say.
Thank you. And before we go to Professor Wekesa, I would like to remind the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please enter them in the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen, and not the chat, so that we don't miss them. You can enter your questions at any time, and we will get to them in the latter part of the presentation. Professor Wekesa, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray, and thanks too to my colleagues. It feels like family here because we were just here a few days ago. And it's like we have just moved from the bedroom to the sitting room to continue the conversation, as it were. I think I'll start off by just acknowledging the points that Paul has raised, particularly with regards to the data that clearly demonstrate the energy poverty of the continent. And I'd like to use that term, energy poverty, as a big descriptor of the challenges that the continent faces. And I suppose, given what Paul has said in terms of the energy needs, one need not go on and on about the energy deficits or the energy poverty that the continent faces. In any case, I think colleagues here on the panel, as well as our audience, will be familiar with that NASA image, picture of the continent as a dark place. I mean, there's this image from NASA that shows the globe, the entire world, with Africa totally in darkness and other parts of the world lit, as it were. And so I think that being the starting point, one wants to look at, and of course, again, referencing the many projects that the African Union has come up with I mean, the PIDA, Presidential Initiative for Infrastructure Development, as well as the energy plan, electricity plans. I suppose one can actually visit the African Union website, and there are quite some major master plans there, as well as the specific regional and country initiatives. Having said that, it appears that to address the energy poverty problem, we will need a major rethink, a major shift on the African continent. And I say this with understanding that everything African these days looks like it needs a major rethink. And energy is actually one key one now in those respects. And I will, reference the fact that there's been an increasing talk of new infrastructure projects on the continent that do not replicate the plans that were put in place in the colonial era, in the post-colonial era up to this point. There's been talk of using renewable energy initiatives. For instance, the US has had the Power Africa, initiative, which was a signature Obama administration initiative and so forth. But these projects, these initiatives, this kind of a renewed look at Africa's energy needs and the projects that needs to be put in place to lead the continent, to light up the continent, seem not to be going very far. And one of the reasons is that many of them are off-grid projects. They are projects that are calculated to have homes get a light bulb, charge a phone, power a television set for a couple of hours. They're based essentially on solar and so forth. But these off-grid projects, in my opinion, and I think I'm referencing other researchers, are not going to go anywhere to address the fact, as Paul put it, that we have over half the population of the continent not with power. I suppose many in our audience and on the panel will have traveled by air on the continent. If you leave Cape Town by flight, going to say London, you will see a patch of light in Cape Town, in Joburg perhaps, and in a number of capitals, but everywhere else is just dark. And that suggests that these off-grid renewable energy approaches that are meant to help homes, domestic use, are not going to go very far. What we need is to invest in on-grid systems that have not been, revamped. In fact, some are collapsing. In the case of South Africa, for example, we know that what is called load shedding or power outages, load shedding is just a euphemism for power being knocked off the grid, are now going to as many as a full day, 6 hours, 7 hours, and so forth. So essentially, that means that, first of all, the infrastructure that was put in place in many places in the colonial era, I'm thinking of the South Africa use of coal, for example, or in a place like East Africa, relying on the generation plant on the Nile at Owen Falls. These infrastructures have not been maintained well. But in addition, not major systemic or systematic infrastructure has been built. Instead, now we are focusing on saying, because of climate change, let's invest in smaller projects that just you have a light bulb in your room to read, and that's it. I don't think that is going to help, because power, electricity is very important for manufacturing, which then links to Africa's development. Without that, we are not going to undertake, build factories. We are not going to, process our minerals and so forth. So while we acknowledge Power Africa, I think I want to reference again Paul here. It looks like the Chinese are the ones who are really helping with major, massive infrastructure projects. I'm thinking here, for example, of the many hydropower plants in Uganda, for example, the geothermal projects that are coming up in Rwanda and Kenya, and so forth. I also must acknowledge that the Power Africa project, which is a US initiative, has actually helped to some extent. We have now wind power farms and so forth. It's a matter of scale. The scaling of those is not at a level commensurate with the energy needs of the continent. And so my sense is that even as we think climate change and its impact on energy and so forth, we have to, at the same time, acknowledge the fact that climate change itself means we have to invest more in energy. Because, for example, climate change means that water tables are going lower. So for irrigation to happen, you have to invest in higher capacity to pump water, for example. I think, Ambassador Ray, I'll stop there with those, kind of unstructured intro comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Michael, last but not least, you're batting cleanup.
Well, thank you. Well, we made it through 2 panelists without saying the word ESCOM, which is the first time that we've done that, talking about electricity in a while. But we did talk about a lot of the issues, and I think the load shedding comments that Bob made are really important. And I think the China comments that Paul made are also incredibly important. So I'm not going to repeat what other people have said, but I will summarize some of the things that I see in addition to that are super important. I think one of the most important things that when we talk about this, there's a saying that Africa is not a country. Well, the African power grid is not a single power grid either. And there's a lot of diversity across the continent in terms of demand, and in terms of supply, and in terms of projections. And so when we look at what's happening across the continent, it's easy to summarize it as the continent of Africa is having this issue, or the continent of Africa has this population with these characteristics, but it's not true. There's regional differences, there's differences between countries in terms of where they are on their pathway to energy transformation. And so it's important to take into consideration the context when we talk about what's happening. But there are general summarizations that can be made. And when we talk about the challenges that are happening continent-wide, the challenges that are happening for the country are basically 2 main challenges. How do you get universal access to modern energy supplies for your population? And then once you get that, or while you're getting that, how do you maintain the affordability of that? So you have 2 big challenges: getting access and maintaining affordability. Now that's difficult when you're doing anything in this world, but it becomes more challenging when the population's growing and demand's growing. And then we have another intervening variable that's going to get put into all of this, which is the mineral extraction industry, the sector, is one of the most energy intensive sectors in the world. And when we talk about electricity, we can talk about electricity in 2 ways. We can talk about the electrical cars we're driving around, or we can talk about the electricity that's in Africa. And they're interrelated, because a lot of the materials that are going to be needed to drive this green transformation in our own economy, one of the places that they're looking at to get these resources from is Africa. And the mineral extraction industries that are going to have to be able to go in and get that are going to need energy. And so that's going to put another strain on this system. And so you have lots of strains. And then you have the historical strain on the system. And Bob talked a little bit about this with the history of the power plants, especially in South Africa, but across the continent. We have some of these power plants that are 50, 60 years old. They're way past their life expectancy. And so when we look at what's happening on the continent right now, it's going to be a huge challenge for many of the countries to be able to achieve universal access and affordable access over the next 15 to 20 years. That doesn't mean it's impossible. There are opportunities. And one of the key sort of opportunities for the continent right now is the ability to transform the entire energy marketplace. And we've talked about that, and how do you finance that, and how do you move it? But one of the things with COVID and COVID's intervention in the world is it threw a lot of things off kilter, and it was really, really a challenge for everyone. And we focus a lot about the impact of COVID on these economies. At the same time, we were seeing, in the case of South Africa, the energy challenges they were facing were literally turning the lights off. In Zimbabwe, people work at night. So these are realities that people are facing. And so there has to be a trade-off that's made between achieving a just transition to energy and maintaining human security. And this is a real political challenge for the governments across the region. It's a real political challenge for the development agencies who are trying to help, because everyone recognizes there is a need to move the economies forward and transition to a greener energy supply for the continent. But there are so many intervening variables and structural variables that are at play here that it's hard to do that without having a burden on vulnerable populations across the continent. And so this is going to be the question really for governments at a national level. It's a priority policy issue in many countries in Africa right now. It isn't just an asterisk you have in some minister's portfolio somewhere. This is what you see in the news. This is what people talk about. This is what's affecting people's daily life. So electricity is a huge issue. And I think that when Ambassador Ray made the comment, this is one of the big issues. It certainly is. And it's going to continue to be. And so the issue is, how do we respond to declining infant mortality, populations increasing, an increasing demand for electricity from the mining sector, the growth of the continent, all of these factors coming into play, which when we look out 10 years from now, 15 years from now, there's going to be a considerable increase in energy demand across the continent. We already have a problem right now without that demand. So we have to get somewhere in the next 5 to 15 years to address what we see coming. And we're not there. And that's the main challenge right now for the continent. It's not a challenge for South Africa. It's not a challenge for Angola. It's not a challenge for Zimbabwe. It's a challenge for many, many, many countries across the continent. And we focus a lot on South Africa because it's in the news all the time. But there are a lot of countries that are facing these similar issues. And I think Zimbabwe is probably one of the most stark ones that we don't actually in the States see very often in the news. But they face very serious challenges there as well. So I'll end with this. How do we get, moving forward on this? Bob mentioned, the installation of solar power and renewable energy sources. I mean, Kenya's done a very big job at trying to do this. Some of the countries in East Africa have made a big job trying to do this. The challenge is, it goes back to the whole human security versus just energy transition and then financing. So you got to balance these three things, and they have to find a way to do it. And in the middle of all this, you have major power competition happening on the continent, and you have China coming in, and they're playing by a different set of rules. And so this is a huge challenge, and we really don't see at this point in time any of the countries having a clear roadmap to be able to move forward. And Morocco was on its path, and the earthquake has obviously had a big hit on them. But it is a challenge across the continent. And it's a challenge that we really need to see innovation. We need to see multilateralism. We need to see cooperation. We need to see governance. We need to see a lot of things in order to prevent what's going to be an even worse situation 10 years from now if we don't take those steps today. And when I say we, I'm not saying the United States. The United States needs to support it, but the we in all of this is really the governments on the continent. And they have to figure out how to do this. And there's a lot of options available to them from China, from the US, from others to help. But it's a policy decision. And they're going to have to make these policy decisions. And they can choose not to make the policy decisions as well. And that's what's gotten us into some of the crises that we're in today by avoiding those policy decisions. But we all see what's coming in the next 10 years. And we all know that there's going to be increased demand for electricity. And so there is a need to make these policy decisions today to avoid more harm in the future.
Well, thank you. That's a lot to process, and it makes it difficult for me to decide what's a good first question to ask you, gentlemen. But let me start down at the ground level, and then maybe we can work up to the bigger issues. You mentioned the power situation in South Africa, the rolling blackouts or outages. My question let's start with you, Bob, since you're living there. What role do you think this issue of electricity will play in the upcoming elections in South Africa and the future of the ruling ANC, for example?
No, I think it's a very big factor in the elections in 2024 on many levels. One being that South Africa has now consistently had unreliable power supply, which has just worsened over the last 3-4 years. This problem began in 2007 or let's just say the mid-2000s, and it has escalated to a point where now it is a top issue. In fact, it's the number one issue for the first time in an African country, for electricity to be an issue that will be prosecuted in the plebiscite that we expect next year. But there are a couple of other, smaller factors related to that. One is that it shows the inefficiency, the incapacity of the African National Congress, the ANC, to live to its promise of economic renewal for the country. In fact, this is the ticket on which President Cyril Ramaphosa came into power in 2018 when he saw off Jacob Zuma in very dramatic circumstances for those of you who follow South African politics. On the cusp of Valentine's Day 2018, Zuma was forced to, leave power, and energy rollouts, the blackouts was one of the issues. Number two, there's a big discussion around what is considered ANC's mismanagement of the economy, because these problems of energy were not there during the apartheid regime period up to the 2000s. So the question is being asked, is the ANC that efficient that they were handed over an electricity system that was working, and like other African countries, they have mismanaged it? And I think this taps into the often narrated narrative of liberation parties on the African continent are given facilities or handed over or took over from the colonial governments, systems that worked, and they have messed it up. So the ESCOM, and the power, systems in South Africa are being held up as a good example of how best to mismanage a country. Number three is the issue of corruption that has infested this. I think there are many reports. In fact, the Commission of Inquiry into Corruption in South Africa that has hit the headlines has pointed out the power energy sector as one that has been infested with lots of corruption. In fact, it gets even more crass. It gets very basic because there's been allegations of some political figures being involved in the supply of terrible equipment or equipment that doesn't work, in terms of also playing around with the coal, which is the major source of energy there. There have been allegations of party leaders and government leaders or those related to them being involved in ferrying coal that is substandard, or even dumping cold water. I'm being very direct here. There's been allegations that they get wet coal that doesn't work to try and whatever. So this is particularly in the area of Mpumalanga. So you can see from the top level is the idea that the ANC has failed to maintain the energy sector, but it goes down to particularities in which some certain political figures are directly fingered for being involved in the terrible energy systems. And therefore, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the Democratic Alliance, are circling around the ANC on those big issues. And particularly so because the South Africa is considered a middle-income economy at a high level of economic development. So the question is, how can South Africa start looking like Burundi or Central African Republic when it's actually supposed to be in the BRICS as an emerging power? There are questions around the fact that South Africans want to imagine that living in Cape Town, living in Durban, living in Pretoria or Joburg, you are in one of the world-class cities, comparable to New York or London or Shanghai. But yet, every so often, you are knocked off power. And more importantly, South Africa is one of the most developed countries in terms of manufacturing capacity, in terms of the productive sectors. And the big companies that, including American ones, including others from Europe and Asia, now can't operate, and some of them are actually leaving. A number of people, in fact, experts who have had relocated to the country from here in the US or elsewhere, are actually, voting with their feet to leave the country on the basis that, hey, I can't use my computer for several hours to pursue my economic, professional, and other activities. So I think it is a very hot issue. In fact, it's almost the #1 issue on the ballot box next year.
Thank you. Michael, I'd like to go to you here, and you talked about this as being a continental problem, and no one can disagree with that. But you're looking at a continent with 50 plus countries of varying degrees of political development and many different ideologies and political systems. And of course, the issue is how to get, because it's a problem that's going to require a lot of inter-country cooperation. What do you see as the organization or institution or group of institutions that can be the conveners to get action, to get movement in the direction of the type of cooperation that's going to be needed to solve Africa's power problem?
Well, one would assume it would be the regional economic communities, but that's not actually happened to date. We haven't gotten to the point where they've been able to solve this problem because, as you say, there's a lot of variance, and there's variance politically, there's variance socially, there's variance with the infrastructure that exists within the countries, and so you have different systems that are operating. So in order to overcome this and to try to address it as a policy issue writ large, that really has to have a frame of reference that this is a regional problem, not a national problem, or not even a subnational problem in the case of how it's sometimes looked at within South Africa. So I think when we to move this forward, we have to actually change the point of reference, and people have to start viewing it that way. But the challenge with that, I mean, you look at Mozambique with providing energy supplies into South Africa. You then get into this whole question of, is there going to be equity within the regions when you start trying to deal with these things as a regional issue? Because you have power dynamics and you have economic disparity between countries as well. And I think that the writ large issue with all of this is, at the end of the day, Africa doesn't contribute a lot of the CO2 emissions that exist in the world. A lot of that's coming from the developed world. It's coming from China. It's coming from the United States. It's coming from Europe. And so you're hearing a lot on the continent, that we should be able to use coal power. Coal power makes sense. We have coal. It's a great idea. It's a quick fix to this problem. Now, whether it's a quick fix is a debatable issue, obviously. But the fact that Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change, and climate change is one of the drivers that's causing lack of reliability in the energy supply in certain places that depend a lot on hydroelectric power. And the fact that Africa doesn't contribute a lot to global CO2 emissions relative to some of the other countries that we've been talking about today, that creates the opportunity for a political discourse here that you're hearing, which is, yes, we need to transition to just energy. We want to do it, but who pays for it? Who's responsible for it? And how do we get there? And so, to get to your whole question, I mean, the Paris Agreement played a big role in all of this to get us in this whole conversation where we're all talking about just energy transition. So at the end of the day, I think that we're at an impasse because we don't know where this needs to get resolved. I think that some people want it to be resolved with the G7 countries and a few others being responsible for paying for this transition, because it's an equity issue, it's an inclusivity issue, it's a fairness issue, and that's one of the sides of the debate. The other side of the debate in all of this is that this should be dealt with at the regional economic community level within Africa, and that it should be privately financed, and there should be other ways of doing this. And so you have a diversity of views as to how to resolve this and how to move forward. Everybody agrees it's a problem, but there's a debate over how to resolve it. And I think that we don't have consensus in any of the regions on how to address this as a group of countries right now.
All right, thank you. Paul, you talked about China, and I'd like to go there for just a moment. And China being the predominant builder of infrastructure and being dominant, especially in the energy sector on the continent. And of course, the U.S. with its Power Africa, small projects, but high tech. Given the current state of relations between China and the U.S., what would your recommendation be if you could sit the senior people in the U.S. and the senior people in China down in a room and get them to listen to you? What would you say to them that they need to do, these two countries, who also happen to be the two largest polluters on the planet, to do to help pull the continent of Africa up to an equitable level in terms of power with the rest of the world?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I would put two proposals on the table. The first proposal would be for the World Bank, because both are shareholders of the world, both are important shareholders in the World Bank. So I would ask that the World Bank shareholders, the top ones, of which the US and China are two critical ones, to establish some kind of pooled funding mechanism. Pooled funding mechanism that is managed multilaterally. We can talk about, whether it could be a panel or a board of directors, but pooled funding into which money and technical expertise and companies and so on, also from the private sectors of the two countries, contribute in order to then begin to support the priorities that have been identified by the African Union. Because the African Union has a very clear plan. It's got a very clear blueprint. The problem is where does one actually get the resources to support those blueprints? So this, I think, would be an idea, right, to get the World Bank to do this, such that China and the United States are contributing resources, both human, financial, and otherwise, into this mechanism. And the mechanism would then bring in the African Union. The African Union would then be able to negotiate directly with the regional economic communities and the countries concerned, to then determine how this money is used, where it actually goes, matching it with the expertise that the countries are providing, to then begin to address some of these needs. So I think that would be the first clear proposal that I would put on the table. The second one would be these two countries mobilizing outside the World Bank framework to bring in other actors, right, from Asia, from other countries. I mean, the United States, for instance, has mobilized the EU, right, around the issue around providing some kind of alternative to the Belt and Road as far as financing infrastructure is concerned. China has been able to mobilize the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, right, outside of whatever bilateral programs that it has, to go into addressing the infrastructure gap in Africa. So I think both countries could find a way in a non-controversial setting, because I mean, this really should be non-controversial. It should be a no-brainer. To be able to mobilize outside of the World Bank, to mobilize other international sectors. So I think these would be the two proposals that I would put on the table. But having said that, I mean, so far, if United States and maybe European countries and maybe countries in Latin America and even Africa could work together to ensure that whatever funding is there can be used judiciously and can be shepherded in a responsible way, I think that is something tangible that can be done at the moment. Because I mean, China has put in what, 49 billion between 2000 and between 2000 and 2021, 49 billion, right? That 49 billion has contributed to 128 on-grid power projects around Africa. I mean, that is quite substantial. I mean, it has contributed, it has added, Chinese state-owned firms have added 25 gigawatts to the African grid. That's just one country. But I think if the World Bank is brought on board, if countries then work towards pooled funding, I think pooled funding is a good way to resolve conflicts among major powers, and it has been done before. It's been done. There's pooled funding, for instance, the United Nations does pooled funding for crisis management, for conflict prevention. We've seen the United States and China working together within a pooled funding mechanism, for instance, in South Sudan and so on. So it's not as if this is something that has not been done. So I think these would be my my reflections on the issue. And we also need to talk about how those projects are actually distributed on the ground, right? Because that kind of that injection of assistance should also take great care not to exacerbate regional tensions, because we do have an unfortunate situation where regions that are deemed by ruling parties to be opposition strongholds, or with ethnic groups that are not in favor with the ruling power, those regions have been continue to be underdeveloped. And before the show, before the discussion, I was talking to you, Ambassador Ray, and I was citing a project. A research project that was released, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, that looked at the distribution of Chinese finance in 47 African countries. And there was a shocking statistic that upwards of 70% of this FDI loan finance went to the home districts of the incumbent leaders of those countries. Now, that is clearly something that exacerbates these regional dichotomies that we see, and we need to be very, very careful that investments in power generation, investments in infrastructure, do not repeat that mistake. If indeed that is what the case is on the ground. But I'm just citing that report that was released a few years ago. So that's what I would say.
Ambassador, can I interject one thing
sure.
in response to that real quick? So I think that the question about pooled funding is really important. And I when we talk about solutions and we're trying to find ways to be able to finance things, that's a solution for financing things. But the solution to the energy problem that exists currently in Africa is a systems problem. It's a systems thinking problem. It requires thinking about systems, not thinking about funding. So I'll use Mozambique as an example. So Mozambique, a very small percentage of the population has reliable access to electricity. And so, but Mozambique as an economy is exporting hundreds of millions of dollars in electricity and petroleum gas to other countries outside of Mozambique. And so when you look at this, this is the issue, that you can solve a problem like how do you fund something without solving the actual issue, which is the energy problem in sub-Saharan Africa and Africa writ large, to be honest. And so I think that this is going to be the big issue for all of us to try to think about. It's not to break it down into the components, but to think of it as an entire system. And the funding is part of it, but the funding is not what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve the actual energy problem that exists in Africa. And I think we have to we have to take a step back. It's just such a complex issue. It's so hard. There's so many different components to it, and we want to simplify it by trying to focus on one here, one there, but they're all interrelated. And it gets back to what Paul was saying about, you can exacerbate conflict in the process of trying to solve things. And we saw that with the dam that was built as a water issue, obviously, between Ethiopia and Egypt. But it could easily be an electricity issue in the future.
Bob, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Okay, just 2 or 3 quick ones. One, I think I'm in agreement with Paul that the energy, electricity issues, in fact, climate change more broadly, is an opportunity for the, closing the gap, the geopolitical competition between China and the US and in Africa. And I think this is already, in fact, happening in some form or shape. In eastern western Uganda, we have had a situation where the Chinese, China National Oil Operating Company, for example, has had struck deals with companies such as France, Total, and so forth. I think in those oil fields in the eastern western Uganda on the border with the DRC. I think we've also seen the building of the pipeline from Uganda through Tanzania, where there's a bit of collaboration between Western and Chinese companies. So it kind of looks like private sector. Of course, some China National Oil Operating Company is actually state-owned, but the oil majors have demonstrated that there's an opportunity for collaboration, and of course, oil links to energy supply. I suppose that's a model that can be used to say, as far as Africa's low energy levels is concerned, this is one area where, the Americans and the Chinese can continue fighting big time on ideology and, sovereignty and other issues. But on energy issues, this is an opportunity to collaborate. But I suppose the approach would be for the African Union to actually lead on this, to serve as the arbiter in their own interest. And I suppose this is something that Addis Ababa, the AU headquarters, can actually lead on. I think the other matter that I suppose we have to look at is increasingly, and this comes out of the Africa Climate Conference that happened only last week, 2 weeks ago in Nairobi, and some of the resolutions there and even the discussions. There's an increasing militancy and, a very serious Pan-African sentiment that the rest of the world owes Africa. I think you've talked of the emitters led by the United States of America and China, and of course Europe are not too far behind. There's talk of reparations and so forth. And I suppose one can understand where Africans are coming from on these matters, because I suppose, without even going into the details in a more detailed manner, there's a clear link between energy and climate change and matters climate. If you just start from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I suppose the international community has to listen carefully to Africans, because in some countries, they're actually saying, look, how can you stop us from using fossil fuels when you've benefited from them yourselves? You continue. In fact, there are climate denialism in various parts of the world. And so you have those kinds of sentiment, but on the African continent, you're saying, don't use oil, don't use coal, move on to clean energy, while you are still polluting and emitting carbon emissions there. So I suppose that suggests that the financing of energy projects on the continent has to be factored in quite, in a more deliberate way. And the rest of the world, the international community, which is usually euphemism for the big countries, have to start considering meeting their obligations. We have had situations where, for example, in the Paris agreements and in the Conference of Parties, there's been commitments by the US, by Europe, by China to fund clean energy projects to actually contribute to the carbon credits and energy-related trade and market, but they have not lived to the expectations. In fact, almost all the commitments over the last 10 years have not been met. So one can start understanding why Africans are saying, look, it looks like we cannot rely on you. So we've just discovered coal, let's use it. And I'm using actually this from the Kenyan, in the Kenyan case. Kenya has never had coal, for example, or oil. But about 5 years ago, there was discoveries of large deposits of coal. So now they have just discovered this coal, but they're being told, no, look, we are moving away from it. What will be the incentive for them to say, hey, we now have it, let's use it? I think I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here. I think we'll have time to get to them. The first question we've sort of hit at, but I will ask it anyway, and get your answers. The questioner asks, is it possible that African governments do not prioritize the electricity issue? I mean, that's sort of a broad question, but it's a good point to make. Paul, you're shaking your head. What's your take on that?
It's a good point to make. I have studied African development plans for a very, very long time. I do not know of any African country that does not prioritize electricity. I just cannot think of any. Whether you talk of Zimbabwe, even when you talk of countries in crisis, countries like Somalia, like Liberia during the Civil War had an excellent comprehensive plan for electricity generation, for energy, for power. I cannot think of any. Talk of mismanagement, yes. Talk of corruption in many cases, yes. You can talk about that. Talk about the gaps in delivery. But in terms of prioritization, I cannot think of any African country that does not prioritize power, energy, and infrastructure. Throw in education there as well.
Thank you. Would either of you other two like to chime in, or does that sort of answer the question for us all?
No, I think I can chime in very quickly to say, very, very, very briefly. In fact, one just needs to look at the manifestos of political parties when they are heading to elections. Electricity supply on the stamp is a big issue. And when countries are, talking about maybe a president or a regime or a party wants to retain power, they will actually point out to, oh, we promised so much electricity and we've delivered. And sometimes, in fact, now fact checkers will come in and say, hey, did you really deliver on this? You said you added so much to the grid. And half the time it's found to be what might call fake news or something. So really, governments are very aware of the need to invest in electricity. Yeah.
In terms of social media and in terms of malign influence and things, though, I mean, this is a seed that's easy to plant in people's minds when they are doing load shedding and that they don't have power and, they're enduring the burdens of all of this, right? And so you do hear people have the perception sometimes that their government doesn't prioritize this issue. And I think what Paul said probably is closer to the truth, which is, there's a distinction to draw between mismanagement and not prioritizing. You can realize something's a priority, but you can mismanage actually accomplishing what you were setting out to do. And there's a big difference between those two things. And so I think there is a perception, though. I think we can't gloss over the fact there are people who have a perception on the continent that their governments don't prioritize the electricity or didn't historically prioritize the electricity issue. And that's a political reality that has to be dealt with in certain contexts.
All right, thank you. Next question. I tend to focus on West Africa in my business. How does pushing out French and UN security assistance advance national interests or even the interests of Chinese investment? It seems to me that one really can't have significant investment without security, and I don't see China placing boots on the ground. Who wants to tackle that one? Paul.
Yeah. China has a very different security approach. China does not go for boots on the ground approach, but China makes very serious investments. Now, there will be problems with it. I mean, we've talked about accountability. We've talked about some elites that want to make a killing. You've got kickbacks. You've got parliament that is not always involved in things, but China does make investments precisely in sectors where World Bank and Western powers have been absent. Now, infrastructure is one, but Western countries have woken up now after having been jump-started by the Belt and Road and all the noise that Belt and Road made, plus the significant investments that were put on the ground. Well, investments in terms of loan finance and this sorts of thing. We can have that discussion later. But I think this is one area where some African countries have been able to leverage it to their own advantage, because the China-Africa engagement, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative, popularized the push towards establishing international vehicles to try and close Africa's infrastructure gap. So the US came on board, the EU came on board, and even India is talking about coming on board. So I think that would be my it's not a boots on the ground. It's not a boots on the ground approach. However, I do agree with the questioner about the nexus between development, security, and finance. There is a clear relationship between the three. We've seen more stable countries like Tanzania. I was in Tanzania for about a month till just a few days ago. And I think there was maybe one power outage for like 2 hours, and I think they were maintaining equipment. But other than that, I think Tanzania has managed its power much better than many of its neighbors. So I agree with that nexus, but comparing the Chinese approach to security with the Western approach to security is really like comparing apples and oranges. The Chinese really don't have, at least for now, this boots on the ground approach. But having said that, I think it was a bad move not to prioritize. Not prioritizing security is clearly a bad move. It's a bad decision.
Okay. We have no more questions, and we're coming very close to the 11 o'clock hour. This has been a very fruitful discussion and one that we could go on for much longer on, but I think it's given us all some things to think about. I'd like, on behalf of FPRI, to thank our three panelists for their excellent presentations. Thanks our audience for hanging in there. And again, remind you that this event is recorded and will be available on YouTube, on the FPRI channel on YouTube within 24 to 48 hours. For those of you who would like to share it with your friends or take another look. Thank our panelists for being with us and ask that you keep us in mind. We will be back for other issues of interest about Africa and about policy toward Africa. We thank you for your support. We thank you for your attendance and wishing you all a happy day and a good weekend. Thank you very much.